All right, Econ friends, welcome back to our third and final video in our unemployment and business cycle, aka our topic 8 discussion. In our last video, we had left off by saying that some unemployment was going to be inevitable in a dynamic economy, and paradoxically, some unemployment might actually be positive. To understand that, let's jump into today's discussion where we think through and define out the different types of unemployment. Because the reality is, my friends, that in economics, especially in macroeconomics of unemployment, not all unemployment is the same. In fact, economists divide unemployment into three distinct categories based on what caused it. Let's talk about those. Once we're done with this, hopefully the idea of some unemployment being positive and some inevitable will make a bit more sense. Finally, after we talk about these three categories of unemployment, we're going to put it all together and discuss this concept known as full employment, which is a very, very important point, minor point, technical point, but a really important point for our future discussions in this class, okay? So let's talk now about the three categories of unemployment. Category one, we call frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is the unemployment that occurs basically when you quit one job to search for another job. Okay, frictional unemployment is the unemployment that occurs when individuals search for new employment that is better suited to their skills, their preferences, their experience. Okay, note that because this occurs when an individual decides to stop one job to look for something better, frictional unemployment is voluntary. And if you think back to the idea of incentives, also consider the fact that frictional unemployment, when you engage in it, you're expecting to be better off. You're expecting, in other words, to improve. When might you engage in frictional unemployment? Well, maybe after you go, so you get your degree, you get your first job, and maybe you get a master's degree in the process. You go back to school in the evenings, you get that master's degree. Now you're really well qualified. Now you want more money, you want more responsibility, you want more title. Your current job's not going to give it to you, so you give notice and you leave that job and you go to another job. Maybe you want to switch industries. You get a job, you say, you know what? I like it, but it's really not where my heart is. I want something different. So you're going to leave this industry for another industry. Maybe you want more money. Maybe you want a job that aligns better with your other priorities like family. You know, maybe when you're first out of college, you take a job and you're knocking out 60 hours a week. And that's great when you're young. But then as you get a little bit older, maybe you partner up, maybe you have kids, you say, you know what, I need more of a balance. So you say, I'm going to quit this job here and go find something that's better suited to my new family life. Maybe you want to move. There's lots of different reasons that are voluntary, all of them imply that you're expecting to improve. So you voluntarily leave one job to search for a new one. This is defined as frictional unemployment, okay? It's important to note that while frictional unemployment is a side effect, generally we believe in economics that the job search process, meaning you leaving this job for something better, that it's going to lead to a couple of important outcomes. Number one, it's going to lead to improved economic efficiency. The economy is simply better when people are doing the jobs that they're best suited to. Think back to our ideas of efficiency and being optimum, okay? It implies that you're making the best use of resources. Your talent, your skill, your experience, your human capital is a resource. So if you leave one job to take one that's better, more responsibility, better aligned to your skills and your experience and your education, the whole economy improves. There's a better alignment. And at the same time, this is also going to lead to higher income generally for employees. So we know that frictional unemployment is effectively a side effect of a job search process, but because a job search process can lead to better outcomes for both the individual and the economy, it's probably a good thing. That's why some unemployment can be positive. Okay. It's also important to note that frictional unemployment can be affected in large part by information availability. How easy is it to know what jobs are available? How easy is it to get information on what those jobs pay, what the average work is like, what your typical day is like? Note that in that sense, much like when we did market failure on information, technology today has really helped people when it comes to making good job decisions, okay? Because frictional unemployment can be affected by information. Note also, and in a more subtle way, that government policies can also affect frictional unemployment. Specifically, if those government policies provide, for example, generous unemployment insurance, which allows people to collect money when they're not working. Also, less in America, but very common in some European and the Middle Eastern countries, for example, regulations that tell a boss how easy it is to hire and fire a worker. Those might influence or affect a boss's incentives, which will in part dictate how easy it is for you to find a new job. Okay, so frictional unemployment's a big idea. It's generally positive, but there can be some subtle causation at both the government level through policy and at the information level that might affect it as well. But in sum, we say that frictional unemployment, voluntary, going to make you better off, going to make the economy better off, and therefore it's probably a net positive. Our second type of unemployment is known as structural. Structural unemployment, as the name implies, occurs whenever the underlying structure of the economy changes. And as a result, it occurs when workers lack the skills needed for the jobs that are out there. Okay? So again, when you have structural unemployment, there's some changing structural characteristics in the economy, like the level of technology, the types of products that are being created, the types of products that are obsolete. And that's going to make some types of skills more valuable, but sadly, it can make other types of skills at times obsolete. Okay? So when the structural characteristics of the economy change, it's going to make it difficult for some people to find work. That's structural unemployment. One way to think about this is to think about a term called creative destruction. Creative destruction is a term that was coined by an Austrian economist named Joseph Schumpeter. And what he said was that in a dynamic economy, again, this idea of a dynamic, vibrant, evolving, at times messy economy, you're going to have all the time the introduction of new products and technologies. But when new products, new technologies are introduced into an economy, it's going to imply that some other products and some other technologies become obsolete. That's that idea of creative destruction. The creation of one thing can lead to the destruction of something else. Okay? This is going to lead to the fall of some industries and of some jobs. Okay? This is a bit of a tricky one. From the point of view of the economy as a whole, some structural unemployment's good because it implies that your economy is innovative, creative, moving, evolving, giving us new products. That's great for the economy as a whole. But again, for the worker, the individual who is laid off or fired from a job because they lack the necessary skills for this new economy, it can be painful. So you have to find that balance, again, as always, between the individual and the economy, okay? So, but if you think about creative destruction, I can give you kind of a sense of structural unemployment. It's also possible, besides the creative destruction part, that structural unemployment can be caused anytime the wages that are paid are above equilibrium, okay? We saw this a little bit when we discussed price controls, but if you take a look here at a basic graph, you have P and Q. P is the price, the wage rate in this case, because wages are the price of labor, and Q is how much labor is bought and sold. And you can see that in this example, you might have here an equilibrium wage, and that's going to give us a certain wage and a certain output of labor, quantity of labor. But you should know now that if for some reason this labor market is not at equilibrium, and if the actual wage rate is above the equilibrium wage rate, you're going to have a surplus of labor. Because again, that high wage rate will lead to a relatively high quantity supplied of labor, but a relatively low quantity demanded of labor. And that gap between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded would represent a surplus of labor, aka unemployed labor, okay? So again, we can have structural unemployment just through the forces of creative destruction, but we can also have structural when the actual wage rate is higher than the equilibrium wage rate. Now the question comes up, why might that be? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, as we discussed, you can have minimum wage laws. And those minimum wage laws, if they set an artificially high price of labor, are going to generate that disequilibrium. You might also get some situations in particular markets and industries where unions are powerful and unions can negotiate wages for their workers that are higher than equilibrium. If a union exists, and if that union is successful in negotiating above market wages for its union members, then you're going to have a situation like this. And finally, there are times when, believe it or not, companies, okay, bosses will intentionally pay more than equilibrium. Now you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute, if a boss can get away with paying less, why would a boss pay more? It's a great question. We call this situation in economics efficiency wages. Efficiency wages refer to situations or to the wages that are paid by a boss voluntarily to employees that are above equilibrium. Okay, that's efficiency wages. These are above equilibrium wages, but here's the key. They are paid voluntarily by businesses to try to achieve two goals. Number one, to make workers more productive, and number two, to try to reduce the numbers of workers that leave their jobs. So you can say, for example, in a very dynamic industry, some firms will rationally overpay their workers compared to the market equilibrium because they want to incentivize those workers to work a little bit harder, to be a little bit more loyal to the company, to not jump at the next offer, to stay intact. If you're trying to reduce turnover, keep workers from leaving, encourage productivity, encourage loyalty to the company, you might pay your workers more. That's known as efficiency wages. But notice that it's still going to end up potentially leading to a surplus of labor. Okay. Final thing when it comes to structural is to point out that, again, some structural is inevitable. The question for you as the economic student and as the citizen and future business owner, policymaker, and voter citizen is to try to find that balance between the individual who is out of work and is now kind of unskilled compared to this new economy, and the economy as a whole, which wants to grow and be dynamic. Okay. Our third and final type of unemployment is known as cyclical. And cyclical unemployment, as the name suggests, is unemployment that is tied to the business cycle. Specifically, cyclical unemployment is unemployment that results from recessions. Okay? We had said before that the business cycle has the ups and downs, that the downs, which are known as recessions or contractions, can lead to some unemployment. The unemployment that stems specifically from recessions and the business cycle is cyclical. In economics, we consider this one to be pretty much all bad. At least with frictional and with structural, there were some positive byproducts. You know, you're going to find a better job, you're going to make more money, there's going to be a better alignment between you and your boss. Or in structural, the economy is growing and new products are coming in and we have new opportunities and technologies. Okay, so at least with frictional and structural, there were some positives. When it comes to cyclical, there's really none, because the root cause of cyclical is that downturn. Okay, so again, three types of unemployment: frictional, structural, cyclical. Different definitions, different causes, and therefore different interpretations. Once you understand those three, we can now jump into a very technical but a really important concept in macroeconomic theory, and that is the concept of full employment. Full employment is critical in economic theory. It is important to note that full employment does not mean that everybody has a job, because we already know that some unemployment is inevitable. So what is full employment? Full employment is defined as the condition that occurs when cyclical unemployment is at zero. In other words, full employment is when the only unemployment is either frictional or structural in nature. Okay, so again, full employment implies that you only have frictional or structural unemployment. Another way of seeing it, the critical way of seeing it, when there's full employment, there is no cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is at zero. You can summarize this with a little equation. Full employment equals frictional plus structural. We believe that today in the United States, the full employment rate would be about 95% of the labor force, which is another way of saying that we expect and are comfortable with about 5-ish% unemployment rate. Seen another way, if we believe that full employment is at 95%, this implies that the unemployment rate, okay, ready for some jargon here, that the unemployment rate at full employment is 5%, and that is going to be only frictional and structural in nature. Okay, so that's the idea of full employment. A closely related concept that extends that idea is what we're going to call the natural rate of unemployment. You can think of the natural rate of unemployment as the flip side of full employment. The natural rate of unemployment is defined as the unemployment rate that occurs when the economy is at full employment. Okay? So we defined full employment up here. The extension of full employment is what we're going to call the natural rate of unemployment, aka the natural rate. This is defined as the unemployment rate that occurs when the economy is at full employment. Seen another way, the natural rate is the unemployment rate that occurs when there is no cyclical unemployment. Seen even another way, the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate that is composed solely of frictional, of structural. And you see a summary here, right? The natural rate of unemployment is the full employment unemployment rate. A lot of jargon, I know. Seen another way, the natural rate is the frictional rate plus the structural rate. Seen another way, you can define the natural rate of unemployment as the total unemployment rate minus the current cyclical rate. Okay? This is really important because, as we're going to learn in a bit, your natural rate of unemployment kind of sets a boundary or a barrier to your potential output. We'll get that in a bit. But for now, note, as I pointed out earlier, the natural rate of unemployment, at least in America today, is about roughly 5%. Notice that the 5% natural rate corresponds to the 95% full employment rate, okay? So again, oops, went too far. Today in the US, the natural rate is assumed to be about 5%, but it's important to note that the natural rate can vary both within a country over time and at any given time across different countries. So for example, you see here, percentages, and you see countries, and you get an idea of countries' unemployment rates overall across some of the more industrialized places. A lot of this is tied to differences in the natural rate. For example, we know that in Italy, Spain, and Greece, for example, the natural rate of unemployment is very, very high. So even when they're not in a recession, when there's no cyclical, they're going to have some really high rates of unemployment, which is shown by the fact that, Greece is running 22.4%, Spain 18.2%. We're talking 1 out of 5 workers out of work. Whereas here at home, we're talking, 4.5%, and South Korea is running 3.8%, Mexico 3.5%, and Japan 2.9%. So we see a lot of variation across the globe in unemployment rates. A lot of that's tied to differences in each country's natural rate. Okay. Final point, once you know the natural rate, you can determine an economy's potential output. An economy's potential output, which is also known as its full employment output, which is also known as its potential GDP. I'm talking here about potential GDP. This is the maximum sustainable output level when you have full employment. Okay. A lot of jargon, a lot of terms. Let's take a really quick step back, make sure we get it. You talked about the natural rate of unemployment. When you factor in the natural rate of unemployment, aka full employment of resources, the economy is going to have a limit. If the economy has a natural rate of unemployment, that's going to imply a limit on the size of its labor force. That limit is going to generate a maximum sustainable output that an economy can generate over time. We call that limit of potential output potential GDP. You might be asking, well, what does it mean? Well, in and of itself, potential GDP doesn't do a whole lot. But the power comes in, and we're going to do this in a couple of weeks in some later lectures. The power comes in when you compare potential GDP the actual GDP. Ultimately, when you're looking at economic performance in a country, you're looking at what is the country's actual GDP compared to their potential. Okay, you're not just looking at how much they're making in a vacuum. You're saying, what is this country producing compared to what its potential production is? Is it underproducing? Is it producing correctly? Is it overproducing, right? To understand that, you have to understand potential GDP, and that is tied to the natural rate. So again, my friends, I get it. There's a lot of jargon and there's a lot of different terms and they mean certain things and the mathematics kind of interrelate. Stay with it. Keep digging into the definitions. But know that where we're headed toward is going to be a discussion of what is a country actually producing compared to what the country can potentially produce. Its potential production is tied to its natural rate, which is tied to its full employment number, which again is what is the maximum sustainable output level in the long run given the economy's resource base, okay? Now, with that said, we have a couple of other small little takeaways. The potential output is the output level that an economy can potentially achieve and sustain in the future. I pointed that out, but I wanted to say it again because it's not just the idea of achieving, but it's also sustaining into the future, okay? That's important. Economies can at times outproduce their capabilities, but only in the short run. It's not sustainable. And remember, in the macroeconomy, we're looking at both short run numbers, but also long run potentials, okay? Note that when an economy is in a recession, and in the next couple of points, we're going to be tying our business cycle, which was what we started with, into this to come full circle here, right? To kind of bring all these things together. When an economy is in recession, that means that there is some cyclical unemployment. And this implies that the economy's actual unemployment rate rises above the natural rate. So if you think about it, when you have a recession, you're going to have some cyclical unemployment. That implies that the economy's actual unemployment rate is going to exceed the natural unemployment rate. And this is going to imply that the economy will be underproducing. Because if you don't have all your resources fully utilized, you're not going to maximize potential output. So in a recession, there's cyclical unemployment. So actual unemployment exceeds natural. And this implies that the economy is underproducing. And if you think about it, that underproduction would imply a decline in real GDP, which is what we defined a recession as earlier, okay? So again, when an economy is in recession, there is going to be some cyclical unemployment, and the actual unemployment rate will rise above the natural rate. And this implies that the economy's actual output level is less than its full employment potential level. Okay. This is a lot right now. We'll get into it in more detail. This will make some sense to you. But just try to put this together and understand that a lot of what we're doing is comparing actuals and potentials. Okay. Final thing, note that while we always focus on recession, which occurs when the actual unemployment rate is greater than the natural unemployment rate, and therefore the economy's actual output falls short of its potential output, it is possible, at least in the short run, for the economy's actual unemployment rate to fall below the natural rate. It is possible, not sustainable, but in the short run, it is possible for the economy's actual unemployment rate to fall below the natural rate. How might this happen? Well, suppose that there is the economy is in a short-term boom. In this short-term boom, the economy is choosing to produce beyond its long-term sustainable level. Again, you can produce in the short term in excess of your long-term potential. It's not sustainable. But suppose the economy is booming and people want more stuff and firms want to produce more stuff. If the economy chooses, they can produce beyond their long-run capabilities to meet that high demand. Maybe firms will keep their factories open for extra shifts. Maybe firms will buy extra raw materials and inventories to produce. Maybe they'll pay their workers overtime. There's lots of ways that the economy in the short term can outproduce its long-term potential. But the critical idea here is this will not be sustainable. And in fact, if you want to push it and get the logical outcome of this, if an economy chose to do this for too long, it's going to generate inflation. And now we've come full circle by linking employment and full employment levels to actual output and potential output levels, to unemployment and recession, and growth and inflation. So there's a lot going on here. We'll go into it in a lot more detail in lecture to clean it up for you. But for now, first of all, thanks for tuning in. I know this stuff is very technical and tedious. Focus on your jargon and get those relationships clean in your head, and we'll put some numbers and some examples behind it in class. Okay? Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys soon.